Good afternoon to our listeners. Welcome to another episode of Let's Start Justice. I am Michael Jackson, Executive Director for Jamaicans for Justice.
And I'm Jade Williams, the Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice.
Now, today is Tuesday, February 28th, the last day of the second month of the year. And we said this last week, but I don't know, it just seems as if the time is just moving way too quickly. I don't know if I'm the only one, and yet still I'm tired. I feel as if it's about November of the year. But anyway, we're going to be having some really interesting conversation today. Today is the last day of Black History Month, and we did indicate at the start of the period that we're going to be talking about where we're coming from, really understanding some of those fundamental rights that we have, but really recognizing the journey that our forefathers and foremothers would have taken to see us recognizing and really what you would say now, having some of these fundamental rights that we have in our constitution. I think we need to appreciate the journey a little bit. I'm going to put you on the spot. Jade, you ever voted?
I'm not willing to answer that question on air.
You know, that's listeners, that sound like a big no. But anyway, so people like me know, I remember the first time I voted, I cried, actually. It was such, I don't know how to explain that emotional feeling I was having, but I cried the first time, and I voted in every single local and general election since, every single one. Every single one.
As is your right to do.
As is my right to do. And yes. As is your right not to exercise exercise the sacrifice of our forefathers and foremothers. Let me not guilt you or anybody else. But it's a conversation that we're going to be having today in terms of understanding our political rights that we have in the Constitution and some of our statutory laws, but also really appreciating the journey of where we are, where we're coming from to where we are now. And as we have a constitutional reform committee that is going to be named, the opposition did name his two last week, but we're really waiting on the Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs, Marlene Malahoo Forge, to give us an idea of who else. And as we have that conversation as a country, we're going to be looking at what other political rights that we need to see changed, amended during this process, and perhaps looking at some of our electoral laws as well. And joining us later on will be Dr. Lloyd Barnett, constitutional lawyer, if you will.
Yes.
So, Jade, last week, what were some of the main things, one issue that jumped out for you?
So many things happened last week. I know that we would have seen the NIDS regulations. The review period ended last week.
Yes.
So we would have participated in that review. Honestly, that is at the forefront of my mind right now.
Okay, couple things jump out for me. Let me start with Grenada. The apology was officially issued, and that 100,000 for reparation, that is, for our listeners. I can't remember the name of the family at the moment. Trevelyan, something along that line. They made their official apology. Prime Minister, Mr. Dickon, how can I not remember? This is such an embarrassing moment for me. Can't remember the Prime Minister's name at the moment, of Grenada. He accepted the apology, and the $100,000 would have been donated to the University of the West Indies Open campus. Listeners, I still remember these things. I don't take kindly when my memory fails me publicly. But the other thing that jumped out, the Parliament had their first all-female sitting, and we saw several young women who represented us well. They spoke about issues of wage equality, closing the gender gap, some of the areas around labor rights for women that we really do need to look at, sexual and reproductive health issues, very well represented among our young women. And lastly, what jumped out is that the Chief Executive Officer of the Child Protection and Family Services Agency, for those who remember the allegations around the Office of the Children's Advocates report and the Robansky issue, the CEO was terminated some days ago, and the contract officially ended, and apparently to close out that contract, she would have received some funds. I won't go into that particular part of it, but for JFJ, E for Life, and Stand Up for Jamaica, our partner agencies, what we have been calling for is further updates from the government in terms of where we are with those investigations that were referred to the police, those who allegedly had obstructed the investigation being undertaken by the Office of the Children's Advocate. Have any of those individuals been investigated by the police, and perhaps criminal charges, if so warranted, would have been put forward? And then those who were in breach of the Child Care and Protection Act, what sort of administrative penalties or so on would have been applied? I think those critical updates and the institutional strengthening.
Right, that's what I was going to add, that we were promised by the minister a certain level of overhaul of the CPFSA office to ensure that something like this would have been caught sooner.
Yes.
And addressed sooner in future.
Yes.
So I know she did make some promises about looking at the structure of the board, as well as providing some additional training to staff members, increasing capacity of staff members. So I'm hoping that we can get an update on that as well.
Yes. All right. So that's it, Human Rights of the Week.
Okay, so we'll go straight into our human rights. So unfortunately, this week it's not coming from the Constitution, because our relevant right from the Constitution we have already discussed, which would have been our right to vote. That has already been a right that we spoke about on the show. So this week we are talking about voter protection. So this is a legislative protection, not necessarily a constitutional protection, that comes under the Representation of the People Act. So at Section 92, it states that voters are protected from certain acts of force, violence, restraint, threats. So all of those actions that are designed or intended to prevent that person from voting or to affect the way in which that person votes. So where someone has been found guilty of that, what we call undue influence, they can be charged, they can be fined, or they can be imprisoned for a maximum of 5 years. And we also have a Did You Know? So no trivia this week, no credit for those who are just tuning in for this episode. So we do have a Did You Know? And it is about our local government authorities. So our local government authority is made up of two arms, the political and the administrative arm. The political arm has the councils headed by the mayor, and they are the persons that determine certain policies. So the administrative arm is headed by a manager who advises and implements those policies from the council. So the only exception to that would have been Kingston and St. Andrew Corporation, where they have a town clerk rather than administrative council or a manager, and the Portmore Municipal Council, where that person who would have that same role as manager is the chief administrative officer.
And just to insert here, one of the things that irks me a little bit as a student of public policy, and it's no fault completely of the population, because I think our political parties and the government, they have not done a very good job of explaining their roles, members of parliament versus that of the local government. And you see sometimes people come and say, what my MP do? And I'm like, that's not the role of your member of parliament. But I think it's what I would say the curse of the Westminster system, wherein our members of parliament straddle two roles in terms of being local representative as well as lawmakers. Because when you look at the function of the local government, for example, the parochial roads is not the highway, but the roads within your communities. That's the function of the local government. Your light, things around waste disposal. Those are some of the areas. So it's a conversation we will have with Dr. Barnett as well in terms of local government election and the unfortunate decision of our parliamentarians and the senators who walked the party lines in voting for that postponement. I think it's a shameful decision that was taken by Parliament. And this is one of those moments I believe Jamaicans should have stood up for their fundamental rights. And I hope that at the end of the program, those who were not aware of what those rights are and appreciate where we're coming from will so do. So I think we can jump right into the conversation and do a quick synopsis before we bring in Dr. Barnett. But when we were invaded, and I use very strong language for certain things. When we were invaded, the British government took over from the Spanish government and took up our island in 1655. 8 years after, they had what we call early representative form of government. And in that particular system, you had white males aged 21 and over who were able to vote. But that ability to vote was also dependent on the amount of property that you had. I see Karen, who put together some really nice notes for us. And he made mention, for example, you would have to own property worth at least £10 or paid a certain amount of taxes. So you get a sense again in terms of...
Yes, so there's a class separation between...
Absolutely. So even among the whites, and for those who read White Saga to see, you remember that language of white cockroaches and so on. So even among the whites, you had classism in terms of who was able to vote in early representative government, which went up to... varied up to 18... Well, let me allow you to finish. But it went up to 1800s, following things like Christmas Rebellion, and then led up to the
right. So so it would have gone up to about 1863 thereabout, because it was a bit of an assembly. And the assembly was abolished at that time, and part of what led to that abolition was that 1865 rebellion led by Paul Bogle, which resulted in the establishment of a crown colony rule from England. So that established a full executive authority that was vested in a governor, and this would have continued for about 78 years. So a lot of our history, we would have had the crown colony rule.
And what was important thereafter is what we call partly representative crown colony government, and this was established in 1884. To put things in perspective here, our ability to vote was still restricted to property ownership. It's just that the funds started dwindling down. For example, it was £3 per year you had to be paying in taxes or own property up to a certain particular value. You saw the opportunity for us to have elected government representative at that time. I think during that period it was one representative per parish. It was a unicameral system in terms of not the two houses of parliament that we have upper and lower. It was just one. The governor, what we know have as Governor General. The governor at the time had all the power, who represented the British monarchy. So you had 14 elected representatives, one per parish, as I indicated, and also you had a 5-member nominated advisory council, for lack of a better terminology. And that went up to another critical part of our history that I will turn over to you to speak to.
Okay, so that critical part of our history would be our universal adult suffrage. So we would have gained universal adult suffrage in 1944. I believe the first election that took place under that new system was September of that year. And basically what this meant was that all persons over the age of 21, regardless of race, gender, and class, would be able to participate in the election.
And it's a couple of things I want to point out here is that, for those who have been listening, you hear me talk about that 1930 labor riots that took place. It actually influenced our universal adult suffrage that we got. Critical part of our history.
Yes.
But following 1944, there were a couple steps and stages that happened. You heard me mentioning earlier that we had 14 elected representatives before. In 1944 onwards, and if you're following that period of history, you saw the establishment of two of our main political parties and tied to trade unionism in 1938 and then 1943. But following 1944, you had your representative increasing to 32 members from the 14, and you had what we call an executive council, and that had 5 members to that executive council, which I think eventually is what you would call our cabinet, if you will. And then you had our legislative council, which also had nominated members for review process, which is what we know would have emerged to our House or Senate. So if you follow what we're talking about here, what is important is that at the time we didn't have an electoral commission. You had a chief electoral officer that emerged, and then following that, even though we started having more representatives, certainly the power for certain ministerial positions still remained with England. So it meant that ministries like defense, foreign affairs, and so on was still with the British monarchy. Important tidbits of our history. We're going to take the break, and then when we return, we're going to be joined by Dr. Barnett. All right? All right, welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. Remember, for those who are tuning in, you can call our studio line at 676-4996, or you can WhatsApp us at
239-7583.
Yes. All right. We're going to be discussing with Dr. Lloyd Barnett. He is an attorney at law, very well noted on matters of constitutional reform. He chaired one of the earlier committees, 1991 to 1994, which led to a 1995 report that is still very instructive in a lot of the conversations that we're having here. And Dr. Barnett is also the chairperson, if that is the correct title, of CAFE. And CAFE is I don't remember what it means, but it speaks to free election.
Yes, the Citizen Action for Free and Fair Elections.
All right, perfect. Jade. Say Jade, young and bright. Dr. Barnett, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm glad somebody remembered CAFE's full
Thank you so much for joining us. Let us just start with just you explaining to our listeners the importance of voting. I'm trying to tell the young one who's just touching her hand, in the studio, why she should vote. So can you just start by explaining to us the importance of voting?
Well, when you vote, you elect persons who govern you, who are responsible for the public administration on which so much of our life depends, whether it's education, health, transportation, health services, name it, the policies and the programs determined by those persons who are elected influence your life and well-being, and therefore the selection of competent persons is of critical importance to your national life and to your sense of nationhood and to your prospects in life.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Barnett. One of the things, as you outlined, that some people will see that importance for the general election, but not so much for the local government election. How important is it for the local government side of things?
I think that attitude is because of dissatisfaction with the quality of the service that they have had, but it's not because of the lack of importance of the subject matter of local government, because local government deals with a massive number of the things which affect the quality of our life on a daily basis, whether it's road, sanitation, in some places even water supply, but a variety of things relating to how we live, markets, barbershops and hairdressing parlors, places of entertainment, public parks, a wide range of things affecting our daily life is under the control and the direction and administration of local government.
So I have to ask, do you think that there is Michael alluded to this earlier, but do you think that there is a lack of knowledge as to what the local government does? Because when I hear people say they're going to engage in local government, it's for a permit. Like in relation to an event that they're going to keep. It's hardly ever in relation, because when they say, okay, my road is destroyed, I'm going to call my MP. So do you think there's an obfuscation there, and how can we address that more effectively?
Yes, that's quite true. that the tendency is to minimize the importance of local government, and that could be because of the quality of service that we are accustomed to getting from the representatives. But it is entirely our fault because we should be very active to ensure that we elect persons who are competent and dedicated to our service and to exercise some sort of critical assessment of their performance from time to time.
And as you speak about electing representatives who have certain competency and so on, who can fulfill our core needs as citizens, can you indicate to our listeners, Dr. Barnett, what is the criteria for being an elected member in the House of Representatives?
Just essentially a Commonwealth citizen resident in Jamaica. There is not any very specific test, in relation to training or academic performance or anything like that, because the fact of the matter is that, and we have found that in our history, that it is not always the formally most trained person who gives the best service. So that we have to make an assessment of primarily their sense of dedication and commitment to service.
So once I have the prescribed age, which is 21 years old, I'm a citizen of Jamaica, Commonwealth. I listened to Minister Marlene Malahufort recently, who indicated that perhaps that's one of the areas that should be or will be reviewed, specifically being a Commonwealth citizen, whether or not we would want to continue with that allowance. I'm not sure if you have any views where that is concerned.
I believe that the next phase of constitutional reform should focus on a limited number of specific things, because it is almost impossible to achieve constitutional reform within any reasonable period if you try to change everything, because constitutional change, especially with such a difficult process as we have in Jamaica, is not easily obtained. So that I wouldn't concentrate on those 3, 4, or 5 matters which are essential, and that will be the first phase before I start dealing with interfering with persons' rights to vote and so on.
All right, thanks. But before we get into those 3 to 4 matters, Dr. Barnett, I'm taking the notes down. But what are some of those fundamental political rights that we have that you think our listeners ought to be aware of?
Well, the Charter of Rights guarantee those rights which are fundamental, which includes freedom of the person, freedom of speech, freedom of association, the right to life, the right to due process, fair trial, the right to education up to the primary level, the right to be treated equitably, and some basic rights now internationally recognized as belonging to free and independent persons in a democratic society.
All right, so thank you so much, Dr. Barnett. So within the context of the rights that you outlined, I just want our listeners to be very clear. So when we talk about freedom of expression, which a lot of us just quickly talk about freedom of speech, you're saying I can go on the TikTok and the Twitter and so on and say I support whatever P I support, and my employer, JFJ, should not come and ask me any questions. That's one.
No, you shouldn't be challenged or discriminated against on the basis of your political beliefs.
Yes.
Or social or religious beliefs.
As Mikhail...
So that you should be You should be able not only to speak, but to try to persuade others to adopt your views on those issues.
Okay, so as Mikkel raised that, she raised it in a personal forum, but what if I was in office having this discussion during work hours? Is there any restriction on that kind of discussion in a
Yes, because
workplace?
your right has to be exercised with reasonableness. And you can't, when you are supposed to be concentrating on your work, go on the phone and start, saying you're exercising your freedom of speech by trying to persuade other persons to a particular point of view or for any other cause. I mean, there has to be some measure of discipline. But
Yes.
the right to exercise these rights are to be respected and allowed to flourish in the proper setting and environment.
So Jade, you are a member of a non-partisan organization, so you keep your political views to yourself, yes?
Okay. Okay.
And other things, Dr. Barnett, in
But
terms...
the rights that we're talking about is not limited to members of political parties or persons advocating on behalf of a political party. You can advocate on behalf of any, ideal or cause that you think merits support.
Yes. We're going to take the break, Dr. Barnett, and I'm asking you just to stay with us for another couple of minutes. But when we return, I just want you to walk us through what freedom of assembly means, freedom of association, and whether or not there are any current laws on the books that may interfere with some of those rights. If we remember with UIC, it was who was protesting during COVID time. That's one thing I want us to touch on. And then in terms of the allowance being made for us to vote on election days, things like that I would want us to touch on briefly when we return. Please. We'll take the break. Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We're having an important discussion about our political rights, which is one of the earlier, what they call first generation rights that we would have gotten as free citizens. So we are joined by Dr. Lloyd Barnett, someone who we personally respect, and I'm speaking for Jade here as well. Yes, his views and so on have guided us well over the years. Dr. Barnett, before we went to the break, I was asking if you could indicate to us just the concept of freedom of association, assembly, within the context of our political rights. That's the first part. And if there are any other laws that you can think of that may very well interfere with our ability to exercise those provisions that we have.
Yes, freedom of association and assembly means that you can get together with other persons who have a common interest or who don't even have a common interest for the purposes of discussing, communicating, enjoying yourselves, because if you hold a party or associating, hold a dance party, for instance, you're associating, but because of the need also to preserve public safety, health, and so on, there are laws which deal with the regulation of some of these activities. So you may have to apply for a permit, for instance, in order to have a meeting in a public place, or you might have to ensure that you meet the requirements relating to fire safety and so on, so that in many of our activities, we have in the interest of safety, not only of ourselves, but of our fellow citizens to conform with laws. But what is important to remember is that any restriction on these fundamental rights under the Jamaican Constitution has to be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So that is a very high standard that has to be satisfied before you can justify the restriction or interruption of the enjoyment of these rights.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I wonder then, we have that right to vote. What happens if election day falls on a work day? Is there any provision that specifically would ensure that I have that opportunity to go and vote?
Yes, there are provisions, specific provisions where employers have to allow employees an adequate amount of time in which to vote. And that is in addition to their lunchtime, so that there has really been no complaint about the adequacy of the time allowed. And this is a very good provision in Jamaica. I mean, we are ahead of many countries, including the United States, in the way in which we facilitate voting. Because when you look at what happens in the US election, for instance, in which people are spending 4 or 5 hours in a queue in order to vote, I mean, it's extraordinary. You normally don't spend more than an half an hour in Jamaica. So that more people in Jamaica really should vote, because it is very convenient.
As you talk about that, Dr. Barnett, a student of mine said to me, when we look at the percentage or the electoral turnout, 37% last general election and the last local election, some 32% thereabout. I don't share this opinion, but I'll ask the question just the same. What is your view on mandatory voting?
I am not in favor. I don't feel too strongly about it, but it's a freedom, it's a right, and you exercise it if you wish. I think the important thing is that we should so conduct ourselves that people believe in the democratic system and wish to vote voluntarily and not the force. So my first emphasis would be on persuading people to vote rather than compelling them to vote.
As we talk about democracy and confidence in the system, one thing that comes to mind is, an analogy that has been used to me a lot is that our elected officials are basically, they work for us as the people who elected them. Now, in my job, if I'm not doing my job, I'm evaluated and dismissed, or action is taken if I'm not doing my job. So when it comes to our political actors, there's a lot less leniency where that's concerned, when we've identified that they're not performing in the way that we would have hoped when they were elected.
You have to wait the 5-year period until they feel like calling the election.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what's your view on citizens having the possibility to vote out someone that has been voted in prior to that 5-year period?
That's a practical problem. It is a problem which we have to acknowledge exists. And there are persons who are in support of recalls, where you can, terminate somebody's term of office because of the improper behavior or lack of performance. But because those standards are so difficult to determine precisely, and because political considerations are going to have a great impact on how it is conducted, it is very difficult for recalls and impeachment processes to operate efficiently, and especially in a situation in which you have political party conflict and contest, then it may be used indiscriminately, and in any case may just perpetuate political confusion or contest or difficulties during the normal term, so that I'm not sure that it would not create a lot of disquiet and lack of stability, and whether that price is not too high to pay in trying to, compel adequate performance.
So whoever has the ability to mobilize on the ground, for example, can just use it to cause further chaos
Yeah.
in
And
Parliament.
you can put pressure and influence by the exerting public opinion and expressing your views that this person has failed to turn up in the community to meet with the people or has failed to put forward proposals for improvements in the constituent active, call on
I think we're Dr. Barnett. I think the internet. It's one of those things with technology. We've lost Dr. Barnett.
yeah,
Yes,
certainly.
yes.
You're right. We have greater facilities for communication now than we had before, and we should utilize it in a positive way.
The two couple things jumped out, Dr. Barnett Jade, with the matter of the local government election and the promise that was made by the most honorable Prime Minister Andrew Holness during the election cycle, of fixed election dates and fixed term. Do you have any opinion on that?
Well, I believe that we have reached a stage now that we should move towards fixed election date, and that is a reform which I strongly support, because it shouldn't be left to political manipulation and to various arguments of convenience, because this is the fundamental basis of democracy and should not be left to the decision of individual political persons at various times.
All right. Thank you so much. I know Jade is very excited to ask you the 3 to 4 areas. So,
Yes.
let me leave Jade to ask the question.
Yes. So you had said some areas you think we should be prioritizing in this first stage of constitutional development. So reform. So I wanted you to articulate what those were.
But I would like to hear from a young person first what is
I love it.
To be honest, I don't know if I have many opinions, but I have questions. So, for example, some of my questions would be, how would we restructure this new system in terms of, for example, the president? Would we have an elected president or would we have a nominated president? What about our Senate? Would we have an elected or nominated Senate? So I wondered. Yeah.
Those proposals are really altering the constitutional scheme to which we have become accompanied, and would require a long discussion on those issues. I don't believe we should seek to alter our constitutional system, because the parliamentary cabinet system that we operate is, on balance, the most efficient of the two. The more efficient of the two basic systems, which is the parliamentary system as distinguished from the presidential system. But I think there are things that I give priority to, and I hope that this will be accepted. That is, first of all, to remove the monarchical form of government. Secondly, to make the Jamaican Constitution a Jamaican instrument. Thirdly, we discussed this before, have fixed election dates. And fourthly, to entrench, that is, to protect within our Constitution the status and role of the Electoral Commission of Jamaica, which has really rescued our democracy and provide a guarantee against dictatorship in the future, because it preserves the franchise, which is the basic thing we have been discussing.
Dr. Barnett, I'm begging you. I'm sorry. Can we take a break? And I want to just ask your opinion on the monarchy and the republic status, please. Thank you. We're going to take the break and then we return. Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. I'm smiling because the young one beside me, she has been chastising me about voter apathy and what us old people, never mind I'm just a few years older than Jade, but I will allow her
many years older.
but I will allow her to just chastise me completely for the rest of the program about why people don't vote, why we don't participate in the process. But before we go into that dialogue, Miss Williams, to you, Dr. Barnett, if we are to remove the monarchy, I've seen several sentiments by a number of people to say, if I'm not getting a president that I can elect, or if I'm getting a president that is merely ceremonial, I will not be supporting the referendum to becoming a republic. What is your view on that, and what can the people practically expect?
I think those are two different topics.
Yes.
My start is that it is offensive to my concept of humanity that a person should be placed in a position of eminence and superiority on the basis of blood relationships, not based upon any intellectual or moral qualities or physical competence, but purely on the basis that that person is the daughter or the son of a particular person, as if they have been given by the Almighty some special quality which other persons do not have. I find that quite offensive, and therefore the change that is most important is the rejection of that personal hierarchy. So that two things I support, which rejects the whole image of subservience, and that is the monarch of England being our head of state, even if formally. And secondly, that our constitution should be an English instrument rather than a Jamaican instrument.
And pledging allegiance and that sort of language and
yes,
so on.
Indeed.
And on the matter of the president, can you just clarify that for the listeners?
Well, there are two different basic constitutional forms, the presidential system and the parliamentary system. And people tend to criticize the parliamentary system, firstly by calling it the Westminster system, not recognizing that there are numbers of countries which have the parliamentary system, which was not part of the British Empire or the Commonwealth. Secondly, the countries with the parliamentary system have been at the leadership of the world in both economic performance and the maintenance of democracy. And that is whether inside or outside of the Commonwealth. And we have seen that the leading presidential system country, the United States, has lapsed into undemocratic practices and threat to the liberty of persons, especially of color, in that country. So that there is, in my view, a much stronger argument in favor of the parliamentary system than the presidential system. It is true that the president in the parliamentary system or the formal head of state is not elected. But again, that person is only a formal head. But the person who heads the executive, which exercises governmental power, is elected and is chosen by elected parliamentarians. So that is a very democratic system.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I think we're at the end of our time for the interview, but I just ask your final thoughts, Dr. Barnett, on the referendum, on leaving the issue up to a referendum.
Well, firstly, it is well established that it is very difficult to get positive results in a referendum. And so that I advocate that those things which require change by referendum should be specifically identified and kept to a minimum, four at the most. Other provisions which do not require a referendum can be added afterwards. But I would recommend that the things which we have been discussing, the abolition of the monarchical form, the adoption of a Caribbean Court of Justice, the adoption of a Jamaican form of constitution, the entrenchment of the Electoral Commission, that those 3 or 4 things should be placed on priority because they will have to go to the people for approval.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Barnett. We really appreciate you staying with us longer than we had indicated. Your views have been extraordinary. Thanks you again so much.
A pleasure.
All right, so that was Dr. Lloyd Barnett, who stayed with us for the program, and I hope we're more informed. But one of the things, Jade, you and I have been talking about political participation and what that really means. And you're correct that a lot of people tend to think that when we talk about participating and exercising our political rights, it's just limited to voting. What other means that you young, woke people can exercise a little bit more? And is it a failure on the state why we have this high level of voter apathy?
Yes, to the last question. So I'll answer that first. Absolutely. I think, and I'm not speaking for all people in my age group, firstly.
You know you're not young, but anyway, continue.
I think one of our challenges is organization. So a lot of people feel apathetic, right? They feel disengaged,
yes,
but also enraged by what they are seeing simultaneously, right? And I think
so you think exercising the right not to vote is also sending a strong signal that I'm not happy with you, rather than I'm not interested?
Yes, but I think that the issue is, unless we were to organize as a country and all of us not vote, the effectiveness of not voting, it doesn't quite have the effect that we'd want it to have. I think that what we could do more of is organization. So I do think that when we are disgruntled with what is taking place, there aren't sufficient voices. And I keep using the word organized, but I don't know how else to put it. There aren't sufficient voices who are in the position, who have the necessary knowledge, able to engage in the right forum to articulate these issues. And I think that the persons who are able to do that kind of articulation are limited in the forums that they engage with. So they might do that mostly on the internet. Whereas to organize a protest of people where you are seeing bodies is not necessarily a part of the organizational work.
But, it's a couple of things for me. I remember our 8th Prime Minister, Bruce Golding. He had an excellent program I used to listen to, where he would educate the people on several matters and so on. The office of the Prime Minister right now, I think there was a provision that started around petition. Though there is no legal requirement to enforce whatever the petition entailed, but I think the commitment was if you got, I think, up to 15,000 signature, then the OPM said they would review it. We're coming up on time, but I think when I look at it, I think it's twofold. Where yes, part of it is that you see the perception of corruption happening, the lethargy of our parliamentarians to really push forward legislation and issues that really impact different segments of society. I think political parties selectively so maintain that partisan approach. For one, you only see them along election time, walking around in communities, taking off shoes and all kind of excitement, pretending to be among the people, rather than focusing on town hall meetings and so on. So I think part of it, you're right. They're to be blamed.
I also want to say one of the things that we don't talk about enough with young people is that a lot of young persons have progressive politics, which is not necessarily
the abortion and
exactly
and so
like
on.
abortion rights, LGBT rights, and when you don't see those things represented, that also contributes to your apathy as well.
Yeah, agreed. But I think also part of it, because I have the luxury of teaching a few, and I think they also need to be a little bit more educated on the things. I've had classes before wherein I asked, when did we get independence? And if a pin drop, complete silence. I mean, these are the realities. So I think it's both ways. But I'm happy we had this discussion today in terms of understanding where we're coming from. And I hope more people are educated on the reasons that we really do need to exercise our right to vote. And if that means you don't turn up on election day, what else do you ask the parliamentarians to really fulfill?
Yes.
All right.
All right, so thank you so much for joining us. I am Jade Williams.
And I'm Michael Jackson. See you next week.
Right to life, right to liberty.